Hey everybody, welcome back to the deep dive. We get a lot of requests for Kubernetes content, and it can be a pretty huge topic to wrap your head around. So we thought we'd take a deep dive into a book that's been recommended as a great place to start, especially for beginners. It's called Learning Helm by Matt Butcher, Matt Farina, and Josh Talitsky.
Oh yeah, this is a good one.
Yeah, and the idea is, before you even really get into Kubernetes, you can kind of understand the why behind it by learning about this tool called Helm.
Yeah, exactly. And Helm is a package manager for Kubernetes that really helps simplify deploying and managing applications.
Okay, so package manager. So when I think of package manager, I think of like, apt or something like that on Linux or brew on
Yeah.
a Mac.
Exactly. It's the same idea, but for Kubernetes.
Okay, so what are we packaging up here? Like what kind of stuff are we dealing with when we talk about Kubernetes? I mean, I know
Yeah.
it's containers, but
Right. Well, so Kubernetes itself is all about managing containers, right? It's this platform for orchestrating how your containers are deployed, how they scale, how they talk to each other, how they heal themselves when something goes wrong.
okay.
And Helm comes in and it basically packages up all the configuration, all the YAML files, all the different resources that Kubernetes needs to actually deploy your application.
Okay.
So instead of having to write all that YAML by hand, which can get really complicated really fast,
Oh yeah.
you can just use a Helm chart and it's all pre-packaged and ready to go.
Okay, so it's like a recipe book in a way.
Yeah, you can think of it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
a recipe for your application on Kubernetes.
I like that. And so I guess this book, Learning Helm, kind of starts there, before it even digs deep into Kubernetes. It says, okay, here's a way to like really get your head around some of the practicalities of it by using Helm.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really like about this book. It starts by explaining why you would want to use Kubernetes and Helm in the first place, right? Like what problems are they solving? And then it shows you how to actually use them.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Why are people even bothering with Kubernetes and Helm? What's the big deal?
Well, the way applications are built these days, it's all about speed, scalability, flexibility.
Right.
We've moved away from those giant monolithic applications, where everything is in one big code base.
Right, right.
And we're moving towards these smaller independent services called microservices.
Microservice. Okay, so you break down that big application into like little tiny pieces.
Exactly. And these microservices are often packaged in containers, which, are like little self-contained units that include everything the service needs to run.
Okay, so like no matter where you put that container, it's going to run the same way.
Exactly. That's the beauty of containers. But here's the thing. When you have lots of these microservices running in containers, managing them all can become incredibly complex.
Right, yeah.
You need a way to deploy them, scale them, network them, make sure they're healthy, and that's where Kubernetes comes in. Kubernetes is like the conductor of an orchestra, making sure all these containerized microservices are working together harmoniously. It handles things like deployment scaling, networking, even self-healing.
Self-healing. So if one of these microservices crashes, Kubernetes can like automatically restart it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's constantly monitoring the state of your application and making adjustments to ensure everything runs smoothly.
Wow, that's amazing.
But even with Kubernetes, there's still a lot to manage.
Right.
You have all these different resources to configure, like pods, deployments, services can get pretty overwhelming, especially when you're just starting out.
Okay, yeah, I can imagine. So that's where Helm comes in to kind of simplify all that.
Helm is like a package manager for Kubernetes, simplifying the deployment and management of applications. It uses these things called Helm charts, which are pre-packaged bundles of Kubernetes resources.
So instead of having to manually configure each individual Kubernetes thing, you could just use a Helm chart that has everything already set up.
Precisely. And that's why learning Helm is so valuable, especially for beginners. It helps you understand these core concepts and how Helm can streamline your Kubernetes workflow.
This is making a lot more sense. So we've got these microservices running in containers, and Kubernetes is orchestrating it all, but it still seems like there's a learning curve involved in getting everything set up and configured correctly.
Absolutely. And that's where this book can really be helpful. It walks you through the process of creating and using Helm charts, demystifying Kubernetes along the way.
Okay, so we've laid some groundwork here.
Hmm.
We understand this whole move toward these smaller microservices and containers and the role of Kubernetes and the basic idea behind Helm. I'm ready to dig into the specifics of Helm, like what exactly are these Helm charts and how do they actually work?
Great question. And that's precisely where we'll pick things up in the next part of our deep dive.
I am excited to hear all about it. All right,
Yeah.
so we left off talking about Helm charts, and I think I'm starting to get a feel for what they're all about, but like what's actually in one of these things?
Well, you can kind of think of a Helm chart as a blueprint for your application on Kubernetes. Like It lays out all the pieces and how they fit together.
Okay, blueprint. I like that. So is it just like a giant YAML file or something?
It's actually a bit more organized than that. Helm charts have a specific structure to them, and they're made up of a few different parts.
Okay.
So like one of the key parts is a file called chart.yam.
Chart.yam.
Oh.
Okay, so what goes in there?
You can think of it as like the cover page of your blueprint. It's
Okay.
got the basic information about the chart, its name version, a little description, maybe who maintains it, that sort of thing.
So it's kind of like metadata?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So if you're browsing for Helm charts online, you can easily see what each one's about.
Right. So you can search for it, you can understand it at a glance.
Exactly. But the real heart of a Helm chart is in a directory called templates.
Templates, okay. This sounds interesting.
Yeah. This is where things get really powerful because templates are basically files that contain the definitions for all your Kubernetes resources, like your pods, your deployments, your services, all that stuff.
Okay.
But the cool thing is that they're written using a templating language.
Okay, so it's not just straight YAML.
Right, it's not just static YAML, it's dynamic.
Okay.
So you can use variables, logic loops, all sorts of things to make your deployments super flexible.
So it's like a recipe where you can substitute ingredients.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, so like imagine you want to deploy your application in different environments. You've got development, you've got testing, you've got production.
Right.
With templates, you can use the same base definition and just tweak a few things for each environment, like the number of replicas or the image tag.
Okay, so you don't have to like rewrite the whole thing from scratch every time.
Exactly. You just have one master template and you can customize it on the fly.
Oh, that is cool. So what kind of stuff can you actually do with these templates? I mean, you said variables and loops. Like, what are some examples?
Well, you can use variables for all kinds of things, like defining resource names or labels, or even the image tag for your container images.
Okay.
You can use conditional statements to say, like, if this, that include this resource, otherwise don't.
Okay.
You can use loops to generate multiple instances of a resource, like, let's say you need 3 replicas of a pod. You can do that with a loop.
You can automate a lot of the configuration.
Exactly. And this templating language that Helm uses, it's actually pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it.
Okay, good, because I was going to ask, like, is it a whole other thing I have to learn?
Yeah, it's based on the Go templating language, but don't worry if you haven't used Go before.
Okay.
The book does a really good job of explaining the syntax and showing you how to use it.
Okay, cool. So we've got our chart.yaml. We've got our templates.
Yeah.
What else is there to a Helm chart?
So another important thing is the concept of dependencies.
Dependencies.
Yeah.
Okay, so like one Helm chart depending on another Helm chart.
Exactly.
Right.
So think about it like this. Let's say you're deploying a web application.
Right.
You probably need a database, right?
Right.
Well, instead of creating a whole separate Helm chart for the database from scratch,
Yeah.
you can just say, hey, this chart depends on this other chart that deploys a database.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Right. So you can reuse existing components and build up more complex applications.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time.
Exactly. And Helm is smart. It handles all those dependencies for you.
Okay.
When you install a chart that has dependencies, it'll automatically fetch and install those dependencies as well.
That's pretty handy. All right, so we've got chart.yaml, we've got templates, we've got dependencies. Is that pretty much it, or is there more?
Well, there's a couple other bits and pieces, like a values.yaml file where you define the values for your variables and a README file for documentation. But yeah, those are the main parts.
Okay, so we've got our Helm chart all put together now.
Mm-hmm.
How do we actually use it to deploy stuff to Kubernetes?
So that's where the Helm command line interface comes in.
Yeah, command line interface. So I'm typing commands to tell Helm what to do.
Exactly. And one of the most basic commands is Helm install.
Okay, Helm install.
And that takes a Helm chart and deploys it to your Kubernetes cluster.
So I would just type Helm install and then the name of the chart.
Pretty much, yeah. You can also give it a release name, which is like a label for your deployment.
Okay, a release name. So if I deploy the same chart multiple times, I can give each deployment a different release name.
Exactly. Like you might have web app production or web app staging or something like that.
Oh, okay. So you can keep track of different versions or different instances of the same application.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can manage them independently.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've used Helm install. I've deployed my chart. What happens next? Does Helm just like take all those YAML files from the templates and send them straight to Kubernetes?
Not quite remember those templates we were talking about. Well, before Helm actually deploys anything, it first renders those templates, meaning it substitutes the variables, evaluates the conditional statements, and basically generates the final Kubernetes resource definitions.
So it's like it's pre-processing the templates, filling in all the blanks.
Exactly. And once those definitions are ready, it sends them off to the Kubernetes API server.
Okay.
And that's what actually creates all the pods and deployments and services and everything in your cluster.
So Helm is like the middleman, making sure everything is formatted correctly before it goes to Kubernetes.
Precisely. And during this whole installation process, Helm also keeps track of everything by creating something called a release.
A release. Okay, so it's like a record of what I deployed and with what settings.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It stores information about the chart version, the values you used, and the status of the deployment.
So if I need to go back and see what I did or make changes, I can refer to the release.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important Helm command, Helm upgrade.
Helm upgrade. So if I need to update my application, I can use this command.
Precisely, Helm upgrade lets you update an existing release with a newer version of the chart, or you can even just change some of the values.
Okay, so let's say I made a change to my web app code. I want to deploy the updated version. I can use Helm upgrade to tell Helm to update the existing deployment.
Exactly, and Helm will figure out what needs to change, update the Kubernetes resources, and keep track of all the changes in the release history.
This is really cool. It seems like it can save a lot of time and hassle.
Yeah.
Hey, but what if I want to completely get rid of an application? Is there a command for that too?
You bet there's Helm uninstall.
Helm uninstall.
That removes a release from your cluster, deletes all the associated resources nice and clean.
So with these three commands, Helm install, Helm upgrade, Helm uninstall, I can basically manage my entire application lifecycle on Kubernetes.
That's the beauty of Helm. It gives you this really simple, consistent way to work with Kubernetes.
It takes away a lot of the complexity.
Exactly, and it's super powerful once you learn how to use it.
I'm starting to see that now. But you mentioned that there's even more to Helm, like some more advanced features.
Oh yeah, we've just scratched the surface. There's a lot more to explore, like hooks and schema validation and testing.
Okay, well, I am definitely ready to learn more. So let's dive into those advanced features next. So last time we were talking about some of the more advanced features that Helm offers, and one of the things that really caught my attention was this idea of hooks.
Oh yeah, hooks are super useful.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you can really customize the deployment process with them. So you tell me a little bit more about how they actually work?
Sure, so basically hooks are like these predefined points in the Helm lifecycle where you can run your own scripts or commands.
Okay, life cycle. So there's like a specific order that things happen when you deploy a Helm chart.
Exactly. There's the installation phase, the upgrade phase, the dilution phase, and so on. And hooks let you inject your own logic at various points along the way.
So it's like adding extra steps to the recipe?
Yeah, you can think of it that way.
Okay, so like what kind of things would you use hooks for?
Well, let's say, for example, you need to set up some prerequisite resources before your application can be deployed.
Okay.
You could use a pre-install hook to do that. Maybe you need to create a database or a message queue or something.
Right.
Or maybe after an upgrade, you need to restart a service or clear a cache.
Right.
You could use a post-upgrade hook for that.
So it's like automating those little tasks that you might otherwise have to do manually.
Exactly. It saves you a ton of time and hassle.
Okay, I'm definitely seeing the appeal of hooks now. What other advanced stuff does Helm have up its sleeve?
Well, another really handy feature is schema validation for your values files.
Schema validation. Okay, remind me, what are values files again?
So remember how we were talking about using variables in Helm templates to make your deployments super flexible?
Right, yeah, you can customize the chart without having to modify the templates themselves.
Exactly. So those variables are defined in a values file, and schema validation lets you define a schema or like a set of rules for those values.
Ah, so it's like making sure you're using the right data types and formats.
Precisely so. If you try to use a value that doesn't match the schema, Helm will throw an error and say, hey, something's not right here.
So it's like a safety net to catch mistakes early on.
Exactly. It helps you avoid those head-scratching moments where you're wondering why your deployment is failing.
Yeah, that can be a real lifesaver.
Yeah.
Okay, so schema validation is definitely going on my list of things to learn more about. What else is there?
Well, we can't talk about advanced Helm techniques without mentioning testing.
Testing, right? Because you always want to make sure your stuff works before you deploy it to production.
Exactly. And luckily, Helm has a built-in command for this called Helm test.
Helm test.
Oh.
Okay, and what does that do?
So basically, you can run Helm test against a deployed release, and it will run a series of tests that you've defined in your chart.
So it's like unit testing for your Kubernetes deployments.
Yeah, kind of. You can write tests to check all sorts of things, like are the pods running? Are the services accessible? Is the application responding correctly to requests?
Wow, that's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah.
It seems like Helm has everything you need to not just deploy, but also validate your applications.
It really does. And this book, Learning Helm, it goes into all of these features in detail with lots of practical examples so you can really get your hands dirty.
That's great. I mean, I'm already feeling a lot more confident about tackling Kubernetes with Helm in my toolbox.
Mm.
And, speaking of the book, it sounds like it's a really valuable resource for anyone who wants to get up to speed on this whole ecosystem.
It really is, and I'd recommend it to anyone who's working with Kubernetes or who wants to learn more about it.
Cool. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. And I have to say, I've learned a ton about Helm and how it can simplify the Kubernetes experience. So to wrap things up, if you're interested in learning more about Kubernetes and Helm, highly recommend checking out Learning Helm by Matt Butcher, Matt Farina, and Josh Dolitsky. And if you're looking for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive wherever you get your podcasts.
And don't forget to check out the show notes for links to the book and other resources that we mentioned today.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.